Have you ever wondered what lurks in Canada's frozen small towns? Welcome to Unheard Fears. Tonight, we're uncovering 9 disturbing true Canadian horror stories. From ice road truckers hearing alien voices in the Arctic to bodies found in pulp mill machinery, ghost congregations frozen in time, and workers transforming at remote canneries. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Drop your location below, hit like, and subscribe for more terrifying true tales. My name is Hudson, and I've been hauling freight across the Tuktoyaktuk Winter Road for 7 years now. February 2019 was supposed to be just another season. Brutal cold, endless darkness, and the kind of isolation that makes you forget what daylight feels like. I'm 34 years old, and I've seen my share of weird things up here in Inuvik, Northwest Territories. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened on that ice road. People ask me why I quit, why I walked away from the best-paying trucking job in Canada. I tell them the pay wasn't worth it anymore. But that's not the whole truth. The whole truth is something I can barely wrap my head around, even now. It was February 13th, around 3:47 in the morning, when it started. Up here, 3 in the morning looks exactly like 3 in the afternoon during winter. Pitch black, stars scattered across the sky like broken glass, and that aurora dancing overhead in sheets of green and purple. I'd left Inuvik 6 hours earlier with a full load of drilling equipment headed for the camps up north. The ice road was smooth that night, which should have been my first warning. Nothing's ever easy in the Arctic. My CB radio crackled with the usual chatter from other drivers. Complaints about the cold, jokes about the coffee at the last truck stop, the standard stuff that keeps you sane when you're alone in a truck for 16 hours straight. But then, the voices changed. At first, I thought it was interference. Solar flares mess with electronics up here all the time, especially during aurora activity. But this wasn't static. It was voices, speaking in a language I'd never heard before. Not Inuktitut, which I've picked up bits of over the years. Not French or any indigenous dialect I recognized. The sounds were wrong. Too many consonants, clicks, and rhythms that shouldn't come from a human throat. I reached for the CB to switch channels, but every channel had the same broadcast. The voices overlapped, speaking in unison sometimes, other times in disjointed patterns that made my head hurt. I cranked the volume down, but I could still hear them, like they were coming from inside the cab itself. Then they started describing my route. Checkpoint 7, fuel cache, 300 meters. And they were right. I was exactly 300 meters from the fuel cache at checkpoint 7. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Maybe it was another driver, I told myself, someone playing a prank. But then the voices said, Hudson, 34 winters, the boy who found the nest. My blood went cold. When I was 8 years old, I found a wasp nest in my grandfather's barn back in North Dakota. I got stung 17 times. Nobody knew about that except family, and even they never talked about it. It was just some stupid childhood memory I barely thought about anymore. But these voices knew. My truck's instrument panel started flickering. The temperature gauge showed readings that made no sense, jumping from -40 to +20, then down to -60, all within seconds. The actual temperature outside was steady at -38. My fuel gauge spun like a clock gone mad. I slowed down, checking my mirrors, looking for any explanation. That's when I noticed the aurora above me. It had changed. The normal flowing, organic patterns were gone, replaced by geometric shapes, perfect triangles, hexagons, mathematical precision in something that should be random and natural. They pulsed in rhythm, and I realized with growing horror that the pulse matched the cadence of the voices on my radio. The ice beneath my wheels began to vibrate. Not rough road vibration, but a steady rhythmic thrumming that traveled up through the tires, through the frame, into my chest. It matched the aurora patterns. It matched the voice patterns. Everything was synchronized, and I was caught in the middle of it. I grabbed my phone to call dispatch, but the screen showed only symbols, geometric patterns like the ones in the sky, shifting and rearranging themselves. I threw it onto the passenger seat and focused on driving. Keep moving, I told myself. Just keep moving and get through this. But the voices weren't done. They started talking about my mother's maiden name, the exact time of my birth, my social security number, my bank account balance down to the cent. Then they went deeper. They described dreams I'd had, not recent ones, but dreams from years ago that I'd completely forgotten until they mentioned them. A dream about drowning in a lake of mercury. A dream about my teeth turning into ice and shattering. How could they know these things? The rational part of my brain tried to find explanations. Hacked CB frequencies, surveillance, some elaborate setup. But none of it made sense. Not up here. Not in the middle of nowhere, on a frozen ocean. Then the temperature inside my cab started dropping. My breath came out in clouds so thick I could barely see the windshield. Frost formed on the inside of the glass in those same geometric patterns. I cranked the heat to maximum, but it made no difference. The cold was wrong, too intense, too focused. It felt like it was seeping in from somewhere else, not from outside. My audio recording equipment, which I always keep running for insurance purposes, started smoking. Not overheating. It was freezing so fast the temperature differential caused condensation that looked like smoke. I pulled over, or tried to. But the moment I touched the brake, every warning light on my dashboard lit up simultaneously, and the voices on the CB screamed, an inhuman sound that made my ears ring and my vision blur. I kept driving. What else could I do? The geometric aurora patterns were directly above me now, so precise and deliberate they looked like a circuit board mapped across the sky. I could see connections between the shapes, pathways of light that shouldn't exist in natural phenomena, and I understood with absolute certainty that something was watching me, not in a metaphorical sense. Something vast and incomprehensible was observing me the way a scientist observes bacteria under a microscope. I was being studied, cataloged, analyzed by an intelligence that existed on a scale I couldn't process. The voices shifted again. They stopped speaking English, stopped describing things about me. Now they were transmitting mathematical sequences, coordinates, data that sounded like it was meant for something or someone else. I realized I wasn't the target of this broadcast. I was just in the way, picking up a transmission meant for purposes beyond my understanding. The aurora pulsed faster. The ice vibrated harder. My teeth chattered not from cold, but from the frequency resonating through my bones. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. My throat was locked up, muscles rigid with a fear so primal it bypassed thought entirely. It lasted another 43 minutes. I know because my watch, despite everything else failing, kept perfect time. At exactly 4:30 a.m., it all stopped. The voices cut out mid-sequence. The aurora snapped back to its normal flowing patterns. The ice beneath me went still. My instrument panel returned to normal readings, and the frost on my windshield sublimated into nothing within seconds. I pulled over, hands shaking so badly I nearly drove off the ice and just sat there breathing. My audio equipment was ruined, fused beyond repair by whatever had happened. My phone showed 20% battery, but wouldn't turn on. The only thing still working perfectly was my truck's engine. I completed the supply run. I'm not proud of that, but I did it. Maybe it was shock, maybe it was stubbornness, but I delivered that drilling equipment and drove back to Inuvik the next day. When I got there, I tried explaining what happened to the dispatcher. He nodded sympathetically and suggested I take a few days off, get some sleep, maybe see a doctor. But then he mentioned something that made me go cold all over again. Other drivers had reported strange CB transmissions for decades. Old-timers called it the frequency. They refused to drive certain routes during solar storms or when the aurora was particularly active. Nobody official acknowledged it, but drivers warned each other, traded information about when and where it happened. I found 3 other truckers who'd experienced it. We met at a diner in town, spoke in low voices, like we were discussing classified information. One driver, a woman named Sienna, who'd been running the ice roads for 12 years, told me she'd recorded hours of the transmissions. But when she tried playing them back for researchers at the university, they got headaches within minutes. 2 of them vomited. 1 had a seizure. The audio files were deleted after that, for safety reasons. Another driver, an older man named Leo, showed me photographs he'd taken of the geometric aurora patterns. But when I looked at them, I couldn't focus my eyes properly. The shapes seemed to shift and reorganize themselves on the printed paper, which should have been impossible. I quit ice road trucking 2 weeks later. My company tried to talk me out of it. Good drivers are hard to find up here. But I was done. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't drive those routes knowing that thing, whatever it was up there watching, transmitting, existing in ways that violated everything I understood about reality. Some nights I still hear echoes of those voices in white noise. The hum of a refrigerator, static on a dead TV channel, wind through power lines. And sometimes, on clear winter nights, I look up at the aurora and I see patterns that aren't quite random. Geometric structures hiding in the chaos for just a moment before dissolving back into normal light. The indigenous elders I spoke to later weren't surprised. They told me about sky watchers, entities that existed long before humans settled in the Arctic, things that observe and measure and exist according to rules we can't comprehend. They said the aurora has always been more than natural light, that it's a side effect of something we're not meant to understand. They warned me not to look too closely, not to think too hard about what I experienced, because attention draws attention. Once you're noticed by something like that, they said, you're never completely unnoticed again. I work as a warehouse supervisor in Edmonton now. Safe job, warm building, no isolation, no ice roads, no aurora. But I keep all my audio equipment unplugged at night. I don't listen to CB radio anymore. And when I hear people talking about the beauty of the northern lights, I smile and nod and keep my mouth shut. Because some things are better left unexplained, some experiences are better left unshared. What I learned on that ice road in February 2019 is that we're smaller than we think, more observed than we know, and the universe contains intelligences vast and old and utterly indifferent to human existence. That knowledge changes you. It changed me, and I'll carry it, quiet and cold and certain, for the rest of my life. My name is Emberly, and I'm an RCMP constable stationed in Mackenzie, British Columbia. I was 29 years old in August 2003 when I got transferred to this pulp mill town of about 5,000 people, tucked into the northern interior where the logging industry runs everything. Fresh out of training in Vancouver, I thought this posting would be quiet, property disputes, the occasional bar fight, maybe some break-ins, small-town policing, nothing that would keep me awake at night. I was wrong. What I discovered in that mill, what I lived through during those 3 weeks in August, changed everything I thought I knew about human nature and the depths people will sink to when they think no one's watching. The call came in on August 4th, a Monday morning. Industrial accident at the Mackenzie pulp mill, the economic heart of the town. A mill worker had caught his hand in the wood chipper during the night shift. Gruesome, but not unusual in an industry built on dangerous machinery. My partner at the time, Sergeant Owen, and I drove out to take the report and make sure OSHA protocols were being followed. The mill foreman, a man named John, met us at the gate. He was nervous, sweating despite the cool morning air, his eyes darting everywhere except at us. He explained that they'd shut down the chipper and found the hand wedged deep in the mechanism. But here's what made my instincts flare. No worker had been reported missing or injured. No one had come forward claiming they'd lost a hand. We examined the scene. The hand was male, adult, and it had been in that chipper for months, maybe longer. The industrial chemicals used in pulp processing had essentially preserved it, preventing the normal decomposition you'd expect. The flesh was leathery, discolored, but intact enough that we could see it had been severed at the wrist by the machinery's blades. I bagged it as evidence while Owen questioned the workers. Everyone claimed ignorance. No missing co-workers, no accidents, nothing. But their faces told a different story. They were scared, and they were lying. The forensics report came back 3 days later and turned this from an industrial accident into something far worse. The hand showed evidence of restraint marks around the wrist, ligature patterns consistent with zip ties or metal wire. This wasn't an accident. Someone had been restrained and put into that chipper while still alive. And when we ran the partial fingerprints, we got nothing. No match in any database. Whoever this person was, they'd never been officially recorded anywhere in Canada. That's when I started looking at the mill's employment records, specifically their temporary foreign worker program. Mackenzie Pulp Mill employed dozens of temporary workers every year, people from the Philippines, Mexico, Central America, brought in on work visas to fill positions locals didn't want. Hard labor, long hours, dangerous conditions, minimum wage. The kind of work that breaks bodies and spirits. I cross-referenced missing persons reports with the mill's employment records and found something that made my blood run cold. Over the past 3 years, 7 temporary workers had simply disappeared. Their contracts ended, according to the records, and they returned home. But there were no flight records, no border crossing documentation, nothing to confirm they'd actually left Canada. They'd vanished from the paperwork, and no one had questioned it, because temporary workers were invisible. No families nearby, no local connections, no one to notice if they never made it home. I brought this to Owen, and he wanted to call in major crimes from Prince George immediately. But I convinced him to wait, to investigate quietly first. If someone at the mill was involved, if this was systematic, we needed to be careful. So I went undercover, sort of. I started hanging around the mill during shift changes, talking to workers in the parking lot, asking casual questions. Most people wouldn't talk to a cop, but I wasn't in uniform. I was just someone curious, someone concerned. And slowly, carefully, people started sharing things. Stories about workers who'd complained about safety violations and then disappeared. About the foreman, John, who seemed to know everything that happened in that mill, who decided which workers stayed and which ones had to go. The mill operated 24 hours a day, 3 shifts rotating through. The night shift was smaller, less supervised, and that's when most of the accidents happened, according to the incident reports I reviewed. I made the decision to check out the mill at night unofficially. Owen thought I was crazy, but he agreed to be my backup, parked a kilometer away with a radio. On August 15th, at 2 in the morning, I climbed the fence at the back of the mill property and made my way into the chemical storage area. The smell hit me first. Sulfur compounds, chlorine, other chemicals I couldn't identify, all mixing into a toxic soup that coated my throat and made my eyes water. The mill machinery never stopped. Even at night, the grinders pounded, the hydraulic presses hissed, the conveyor belts rattled along carrying wood pulp through various processing stages. The sound was overwhelming, a constant industrial roar that swallowed every other noise. Perfect place to hide screams, perfect place to dispose of evidence. I moved through the shadows, checking the areas where the first hand had been found. The wood chipper had been cleaned and put back into service, but nearby I found another processing unit, a massive pulping machine that broke down wood fibers using a combination of mechanical grinding and chemical baths. And inside one of the chemical vats, preserved in the brine-like solution, I saw something that made me freeze. Bone fragments. Small pieces, but unmistakable. I was photographing the evidence when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and John was standing there, 15 feet away, holding a heavy wrench. His face was calm, almost serene, which was somehow worse than if he'd looked angry or afraid. He asked me what I was doing there, and I told him the truth. I was investigating murders. He didn't deny it. Instead, he started talking, his voice barely audible over the machinery. He told me about the pressure the mill was under, about safety violations that would have shut them down, about workers who threatened to report to authorities. He made it sound reasonable, like he'd had no choice. The mill employed half the town. If it closed, Mackenzie would die. So certain problems had to be disposed of to protect the greater good. He came at me fast, faster than I expected from a man in his 50s. The wrench swung toward my head, and I barely dodged. We fought in that chemical storage area, surrounded by vats of toxic solutions and machinery that could pulp human bones as easily as wood. He was strong, strengthened by years of manual labor, and he was fighting to silence the only person who knew his secret. I managed to get my radio, screamed for Owen, but I don't know if he heard over the machinery noise. John got his hands around my throat, lifting me toward one of the open vats. The chemical smell was overwhelming, burning my nostrils, and I could feel the heat rising from the solution below. I don't remember exactly how I broke free. Adrenaline, training, pure survival instinct. My hand found something, a pipe, a tool, I'm not sure, and I swung it into his knee. He dropped me, stumbled back, and in that moment, Owen burst through the door with 2 other officers. They'd heard my radio call and come in fast. John tried to run, but there was nowhere to go in that maze of machinery and chemicals. We caught him at the pulp processing line, tackled him to the ground while he screamed about protecting the town, about doing what needed to be done. The investigation that followed was massive. Forensics teams spent weeks at that mill. They found remains in 4 different locations: the wood chipper, 2 chemical vats, and buried beneath the floor of an old storage building that had been demolished and rebuilt in 2001. DNA analysis eventually identified 7 victims, all temporary foreign workers, all people who had complained about safety conditions or threatened to report violations to authorities. John had killed them systematically over 3 years, using the mill itself as his weapon and disposal system. The machinery that processed wood also processed human remains, breaking them down into fragments so small they became part of the industrial waste stream. The mill closed 6 months later, not because of direct legal action, but because the scandal destroyed its reputation. Workers quit. Contracts were canceled. The town of Mackenzie lost its economic heart, and the population dropped by almost half within 2 years. Some people blamed me for that. They said I should have left it alone, that those workers were nobody, that protecting the mill should have been the priority. But I think about those 7 people, Alexander, Santiago, and 5 others whose names I now know by heart. They came to Canada hoping for better lives, for opportunities, and they died alone in a mill where their deaths were treated as acceptable collateral damage for profit margins and employment statistics. I left Mackenzie in 2004, transferred to a different detachment, where people didn't know my face or my history, but I still smell that mill sometimes. The sulfur, the chlorine, the sweet rot scent of pulp processing. I smell it in my nightmares, and I wake up with my throat tight like John's hands are still there. I testified at his trial. He got 7 life sentences, no possibility of parole, and he showed no remorse. Even in court, he maintained he'd been protecting the community, doing what was necessary. The thing about evil is that it's rarely obvious. John wasn't a monster in appearance. He was a respected foreman, a church deacon, a man who coached Little League and volunteered at community events. But he decided that some lives mattered more than others. The temporary workers were disposable, and he'd built a system to make them disappear without consequence. The scariest part, he'd been right that no one would notice. If that hand hadn't surfaced in the chipper, if the preservation chemicals hadn't prevented normal decomposition, those 7 people would still be missing and forgotten. I'm 36 now, still with the RCMP, working major crimes in a larger city. I've investigated dozens of homicides since Mackenzie, seen violence in forms that would break most people. But that Mill case stays with me in ways the others don't. It taught me that the worst crimes often hide in plain sight, wrapped in economic necessity and community protection. It taught me that institutions can be just as deadly as individuals when profit becomes more important than human life. And it taught me that the people society deems invisible, temporary workers, migrants, anyone without power or connections, are the most vulnerable to systematic violence because their disappearance raises no alarms. If you're watching this, wherever you are, I want you to think about the invisible people in your community, the workers you don't notice, the faces you pass without seeing, the people whose labor supports your comfort, but whose names you'll never know. Remember that they're human beings with families and dreams and the same right to safety that you have. And if you see something wrong, if you witness exploitation or abuse or danger, speak up. Don't assume someone else will handle it. Those 7 people in Mackenzie died because everyone assumed someone else was paying attention, and no one was. Don't let that happen in your community. Be the person who notices. Be the person who cares. Because in the end, a society is judged not by how it treats its most powerful members, but by how it protects its most vulnerable. My name is Luca, and I'm 41 years old. I maintain the grounds at Batoche National Historic Site in Saskatchewan, where the 1885 Northwest Resistance made its final stand against government forces. It's a beautiful place most of the time. Rolling prairie hills, the South Saskatchewan River cutting through the landscape, and the old church standing as a reminder of everything that was lost here. I've worked this job for 6 years, and for the most part, it's peaceful work. Mowing grass, repairing fences, keeping the historic buildings secure during the off-season when tourists aren't around. But in October 1997, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew about history, memory, and the way trauma can scar a place so deeply that it never truly heals. It started on October 7th, just after dawn. I'd arrived early to check on the church before the first frost really set in. The building needed some weatherproofing work, and I wanted to assess what supplies I'd need. As I approached, I heard singing. French hymns, clear and beautiful, coming from inside the locked church. My first thought was that someone had broken in. Maybe some religious group wanting to hold an unauthorized service. I unlocked the door, ready to politely ask them to leave, and stepped inside. The interior was empty, completely empty. But the singing continued, surrounding me from all directions, dozens of voices harmonizing in Old French that I barely understood despite growing up in a bilingual household. And the temperature inside was impossibly warm. Maybe 25 degrees Celsius, when it should have been close to freezing. I stood there, frozen myself, listening, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The hymn was O Salutaris Hostia, a communion song I recognized from my grandmother's funeral years before. The voices were joyful, reverent, filled with a faith and certainty that seemed to warm the very air around me. I walked down the center aisle, and that's when I saw them. Figures, translucent but distinct, filling the wooden pews. Men in rough wool clothing from the 1880s, women in long dresses with their hair covered, children sitting still with the kind of discipline you don't see in modern kids. They were attending Mass, completely unaware of my presence, singing together as morning light streamed through the stained glass windows in a way that made everything look sepia-toned, like an old photograph come to life. At the front of the church, a priest stood at the altar. Father Moulin, I realized, recognizing him from historical photographs in the visitor center. He'd been the parish priest here in 1885, a man who'd tried to negotiate peace between the Métis resistance fighters and the government forces. He was conducting the service in Latin, his voice carrying over the congregation's responses, and everything about the scene was peaceful, ordinary, A normal Sunday Mass from 112 years ago playing out in there in front of me like I'd stepped through time. I should have run. Every rational instinct told me to get out of that church and never come back. But I couldn't move. I was transfixed, watching these ghosts or memories or whatever they were, living their final moments of normalcy before everything fell apart. Because I knew the history, I knew what came next. On May 9th, 1885, this church and the community around it became a battlefield. Government forces attacked, and the resistance was crushed. The official histories talk about military casualties, about the rebellion's leaders being executed or exiled, but they don't talk much about what happened to the civilians, to the families caught in the crossfire, to the children who were here one day and gone the next. The Mass continued. I watched the priest raise the communion host, watched the congregation bow their heads in prayer. Outside the windows, I could hear children playing, their laughter floating on air that shouldn't carry sound from over a century ago. A young boy, maybe 8 years old, sat in the pew closest to me. He had dark hair and wore a wool vest that was too big for him, probably a hand-me-down from an older sibling. He was fidgeting, the way kids do during long services, and his mother kept giving him warning looks to sit still. He was so real, so alive, that I almost reached out to touch him before remembering that he'd been dead for longer than I'd been alive. Then Father Moulin stopped mid-prayer. He turned slowly, deliberately, and looked directly at me. His eyes were sad, impossibly sad, carrying the weight of knowledge that shouldn't exist. He spoke, and even though it was in French, I understood him perfectly. You cannot change what has already been written. His voice echoed through the church, and suddenly all the figures turned to look at me. Every man, woman, and child, their faces filled with a terrible awareness. They knew. They knew what was coming for them, knew that in a few weeks they would be scattered, killed, or displaced, their community destroyed, their way of life erased. And they were trapped in this moment, the last peaceful Mass before the storm, reliving it over and over for more than a century. The mother of the fidgeting boy reached out toward me, her mouth forming words I couldn't hear. The light through the stained glass windows began to flicker, and I smelled smoke, gunpowder, the acrid stench of burning wood, and something worse, something organic that I didn't want to identify. The hymn singing turned discordant, notes clashing against each other, and the warm air suddenly felt suffocating. I stumbled backward, knocked into a pew, and the impact broke whatever spell had been holding me. I ran out of that church like my life depended on it. And I didn't stop until I was in my truck with the engine running and the heater blasting, trying to convince myself I hadn't just experienced what I knew I'd experienced. I didn't go back to work for 3 days. I called in sick, which I'd never done before in 6 years on the job. I spent those days in the archives at the Provincial Library in Saskatchewan, reading everything I could find about Batoche in 1885. The official National Historic Site materials were sanitized, focused on military tactics and political implications. But I dug deeper, into local newspapers from the time, into personal letters and diaries that had been donated to the archives over the decades. And I found references to something that had been quietly removed from the public historical record. On May 8th, 1885, the day before the final battle, a large group of civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly men, took refuge in the church. They believed it would be respected as a sanctuary, that soldiers on both sides would honor the sacred space. They were wrong. When the government forces overran the resistance positions the next day, the church was shelled. Not extensively, not enough to completely destroy it, but enough. At least 23 civilians died inside that church, some from the shelling, others from the fire that started afterward. The incident was covered up, officially recorded as minimal civilian casualties, in reports filed by commanding officers who didn't want to deal with the public relations nightmare of having massacred people in a church. I found a roster, handwritten, in a collection of documents donated by a priest who'd served in the area in the 1920s. It listed names of parishioners who'd been present at the final Mass before the battle, the Mass I'd witnessed. Every single name on that list appeared in burial records from May 1885, or in displacement records showing families who'd fled and never returned. That congregation I'd seen, those people singing and praying, they were having their last moment of peace, their final hours of innocence before violence destroyed everything they knew. I went back to the church on the fourth day, October 11th. The site supervisor was worried about me, asked if everything was okay, if I needed to take more time off. I told him I was fine, just a bad flu. I returned to my maintenance duties, but I waited until late afternoon when the last tourists had left. Then I entered the church again, alone. It was cold inside, normal autumn cold, and completely empty. No singing, no figures, no impossible warmth. I sat in one of the pews, the same pew where I'd seen the fidgeting boy and his mother, and I just sat there as the light faded. At exactly 6:17 p.m., it happened again. The temperature rose, the light took on that sepia quality, and I heard the singing start, faint at first, then growing stronger. But this time I didn't run. I stayed seated, and I watched as the congregation materialized around me. The priest appeared at the altar, the families filled the pews, and outside I could hear children playing in the fading daylight. I realized they were trapped in a loop, endlessly reliving this moment because it was the last time they'd all been together, the last time they'd felt safe and whole before everything shattered. Father Moulin looked at me again, and this time his expression was different. Not sad, but pleading. He wanted something from me, needed something. I understood then what historians and officials had done by suppressing this story. They'd erased these people twice, once by killing them and destroying their community, and again by removing them from the historical record, by pretending their deaths didn't matter or didn't happen. These spirits weren't haunting the church out of malice or unfinished business in the traditional sense. They were trying to be remembered, to have their existence and their deaths acknowledged, to not fade into complete oblivion. I spent the next 2 weeks researching and documenting everything I could find about the civilian casualties at Batoche. I contacted historians, indigenous rights groups, and Métis cultural organizations. I made copies of the documents I'd found in the archives and provided them to people who could do something with the information. It took years. This was 1997, and the process of historical revision moved slowly, but eventually the National Historic Site updated its interpretive materials to acknowledge what really happened at the church. A memorial was installed in 2003, listing the names of civilians who died during the battle, including the 23 who perished in the church. I still work at Batoche. I'm 48 now, and this place is as much a part of me as my own history. The congregation still appears sometimes, usually on October 7th, around the anniversary of that last Mass. But they're different now. The desperation is gone. They sing their hymns, they pray their prayers, and sometimes Father Moulin looks at me and nods, a gesture of acknowledgement and maybe gratitude. They're still trapped in that moment, still reliving the last piece before the storm. But they're remembered now. Their deaths matter. Their lives matter. And maybe that's enough to give them some measure of rest. History isn't just dates and battles and political movements. It's people, real people with families and fears and faith. People who loved and worked and hoped for futures that were stolen from them. When we erase those people from the record, when we sanitize the violence to make it more palatable or politically convenient, we commit a second violence against them. We make them disappear all over again. The ghosts at Batoche taught me that. They taught me that memory is a form of justice, and that bearing witness to suffering, even suffering that happened over a century ago, is one of the most important things we can do. If you're watching this from somewhere in Canada, or the United States, or anywhere else where history is complicated and painful, I want you to think about the stories that aren't being told in your community. The unmarked graves, the suppressed documents, the incidents that officials would prefer everyone forget. Seek out those stories. Bring them into the light. Give voice to the people who were silenced. Because the dead can't speak for themselves, but they can haunt us until we're willing to listen, until we're willing to remember, until we're finally willing to tell the truth about what happened and why it matters. That's what I learned in that church in October 1997, and it's a lesson I carry with me every single day. My name is Elias, and I'm 27 years old. I work the processing line at a salmon cannery in Port Hardy, British Columbia, right where the northern tip of Vancouver Island meets the open Pacific. It's hard work, 12-hour shifts during peak season, standing at stainless steel stations while thousands of fish move past you on conveyor belts, your hands moving on autopilot with knives and processing tools. The smell of fish and brine becomes so much a part of you that you stop noticing it after a while. I'd been working there for 3 seasons when May 2016 rolled around, and everything I thought I knew about the ocean, about biology, about the natural order of things, got turned completely inside out. What happened at that cannery changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand, and it made me afraid of water in a way that doesn't make rational sense, but feels absolutely justified every single day. The season started normally enough. We'd gotten our crew together in early May, a mix of locals and temporary workers who came up from Vancouver and further south for the high-paying seasonal work. The sockeye runs were expected to be strong that year, which meant long hours and good money for everyone willing to put in the work. I was stationed on the primary processing line, which meant I handled fish right after they came off the boats, sorting by size and quality before they moved down the line to gutting, cleaning, and eventually canning. It was mindless work, but it paid well, and I'd gotten good at it over the years. My hands knew what to do without my brain needing to be fully engaged, which was both a blessing and a curse, depending on how tired I was. Around May 15th, one of my co-workers, a guy named Dylan, started complaining about his hands. We all got cuts and scrapes. It was inevitable when you worked with sharp tools and fish all day. But Dylan's injuries looked different. The skin on his palms and fingers had developed these strange lesions that looked almost like fish scales. Small, translucent patches that caught the light weird, like they had their own internal structure. He showed them to the floor supervisor, who told him it was probably an allergic reaction to the brine solution we used to clean the equipment and preserve the catch. They gave him some cream and told him to wear better gloves. Dylan kept working, but the lesions didn't go away. They spread. Within a week, both his hands were covered in these scale-like patches, and the skin between his fingers started looking webbed, thickened somehow. He should have gone to a doctor, should have taken time off, but it was peak season, and the money was too good to walk away from. Plus, it didn't seem to hurt him. If anything, Dylan seemed fine with it, almost indifferent to the physical changes. He started spending his breaks at the brine tanks where we soaked equipment, running his hands through the salt water like he needed the moisture. I thought it was weird, but everyone has their coping mechanisms for the stress and monotony of cannery work. Then Melina got it. She worked 2 stations down from me, a tough woman in her early 30s who'd been doing this work longer than I had. The same lesions appeared on her hands, the same translucent quality to the affected skin, and like Dylan, she developed this compulsion to keep her hands wet, constantly dipping them in the brine, splashing water on her arms during breaks. Her skin started taking on this strange quality, not quite translucent, but you could see the veins and tissue structure underneath in a way that wasn't normal. And her fingers, the webbing between them got more pronounced, like the connective tissue was thickening and spreading, By the end of May, 7 workers on our line had developed the condition. All of us worked with the catch directly, handling the fresh fish as they came in. The management finally got concerned enough to bring in someone from occupational health to look at us. The inspector took samples, examined the brine tanks, checked the fish themselves for parasites or toxins. Everything came back normal. No bacteria, no chemical contamination, no known allergens or pathogens. We were just supposed to keep working, keep an eye on the symptoms, report if anything got worse. But how do you report that your coworkers are starting to look less human and more like something that belongs underwater? The affected workers started changing in other ways, too. They became quieter, spoke less, seemed withdrawn from the rest of us who weren't showing symptoms. During breaks, instead of heading to the break room or outside for fresh air, they congregated at the large brine holding tanks near the loading dock. I watched them one afternoon, standing in a group with their hands and forearms submerged in the cold salt water, their eyes closed like they were in some kind of meditative state. Their breathing had changed too, more through the mouth than the nose, these deeper, slower breaths that reminded me of how fish process oxygen through their gills. I confronted Dylan about it one evening after shift. We'd been friendly before all this started, used to grab beers sometimes at the pub in town, but when I asked him what was happening, what he was feeling, he looked at me with eyes that seemed different somehow. The color was the same, but there was something else there, something that made me think of deep water and cold currents. He told me he felt fine, better than fine, actually. He said the water felt like home in a way the air never had, that when he put his hands in the brine, he could feel something calling to him, something ancient and welcoming. Then he showed me his fingers. The webbing had progressed to the point where his hands looked almost like flippers, the individual fingers still visible but connected by thick membranes that were definitely not normal human tissue. I went to the plant manager, a man named Julian, who'd been running this cannery for 15 years. I told him what I'd seen, insisted that something was seriously wrong, and we needed to shut down the line, get real medical help for the affected workers. Julian listened, his face getting grimmer as I talked. Then he told me something that made my blood run cold. 3 weeks earlier, one of their offshore processors had brought up something strange in the nets. Not fish, but a cluster of what looked like eggs or seed pods, each about the size of a baseball covered in a gelatinous membrane. The crew hadn't known what to make of them, so they dumped them in the live well with the catch and brought everything back to port. Those pods had been processed through our system, broken down in the initial sorting, and their contents had contaminated the brine tanks. Julian had already contacted marine biologists at the university, but no one could identify what the pods were. They didn't match any known species of fish, mollusk, or marine plant, and by the time anyone thought to properly contain them, they'd already been flushed out with the regular wastewater discharge. Whatever biological agent had been in those pods was in our brine system, in our processing water, and apparently in the tissue of 7 workers who'd been exposed to it over the past 3 weeks. The university wanted to study it, wanted to bring the affected workers in for observation, but Julian was terrified of the legal liability and the public relations nightmare. A cannery spreading unknown biological contamination to its workers would mean investigations, lawsuits, and probably permanent closure. On June 2nd, the 7 affected workers disappeared. All of them, in one night. I came in for the morning shift and they were just gone. Their lockers had been cleaned out, their time cards pulled, like they'd never worked there at all. I asked around, and nobody seemed to know anything or want to talk about it. But one of the night security guards, an older guy who'd worked there since the cannery opened, pulled me aside. He told me he'd been doing his rounds around 3 in the morning and heard sounds from the loading dock. When he went to investigate, he saw them, all 7 workers, moving toward the water. They were naked, and in the security lights he could see that the changes had progressed far beyond what I'd last observed. Their skin had taken on a fully scaled appearance. Their limbs had changed proportion. and they moved wrong, like they weren't quite built for land anymore. He watched them walk into the ocean, not swim, walk, straight out into the cold Pacific water until it was over their heads and they disappeared beneath the surface. He'd filed a report, but management buried it. Called it a mass hallucination, stress-induced delusion. The official story was that those 7 workers had quit and gone home, terminated their contracts early. Their families were told the same thing, but I knew better. I'd seen the progression. I'd watched my co-workers transform into something that belonged underwater more than on land, and whatever was in those pods had done it to them, had rewritten their biology in ways that shouldn't be possible. I quit 2 weeks later. Couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't stand at those processing lines knowing that the ocean had reached up and claimed 7 people, had transformed them into something else and pulled them back down into the depths. The cannery closed the following year, officially for economic reasons. But everyone who'd worked there during May and June of 2016 knew the real reason. You can't run a processing plant where the workers might transform into marine life and walk back into the sea. You can't handle seafood when you're terrified it might contain something that rewrites human DNA into something adapted for deep water. I work in a warehouse now, in Kamloops, about as far inland as you can get in British Columbia. I don't eat seafood anymore, can't even stand the smell of it. I take showers instead of baths because submerging myself in water, even clean tap water, makes me panic. And I have nightmares about those 7 workers, about Dylan and Melina and the others, swimming in cold, dark water somewhere off the coast of Vancouver Island, changed into something that doesn't need to breathe air anymore, something that found home in the ocean and never came back. The worst part is wondering if they're happy, if the transformation was painful, or if it felt like coming home, like Dylan said. If there are more of them now, if whatever was in those pods is still out there in the deep water, waiting to be brought up in another fishing net, ready to transform another group of workers into marine life that walks back to the sea. The ocean is vast and ancient and full of things we don't understand, things that existed long before humans and will exist long after we're gone. And sometimes those things reach up through our nets and fishing lines and processing plants, and they take people back down with them, changing them into something that belongs to the deep. If you're watching this from anywhere near the ocean, from any coastal town in the United States or Canada, I want you to understand something. The sea isn't empty. It's full of life we haven't cataloged, haven't studied, haven't even seen, and some of that life has capabilities we can't explain with current biology, abilities to transform and adapt and incorporate other organisms into itself. What happened at Port Hardy in 2016 wasn't unique. I've heard similar stories from fishing communities up and down the coast, whispered accounts of workers who developed strange symptoms and disappeared into the water. Pay attention to the people around you who work with the ocean's harvest. Watch for changes, for strange symptoms, for that distant look that means they're hearing something calling from the depths. And if you see it, get them help before the transformation completes, before the ocean claims another life and pulls it down into the cold darkness where we can't follow. That's what I learned in that cannery, and it's a lesson I'll carry until I die. The ocean gives, but it also takes. And sometimes, what it takes, it changes first. My name is Amani, and I'm 33 years old. I work as a forestry surveyor in Newfoundland, conducting timber surveys in the interior forests where most people never go. It's solitary work, which suits me fine. I spend weeks at a time in the backcountry with just my GPS equipment, compass, and camping gear, marking trees and mapping terrain for logging operations. The forests here are ancient and beautiful, especially around Deer Lake, where the boreal wilderness stretches for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. In July 2011, I took a contract to survey a valley that local crews had been avoiding for years. They'd tell me it was too remote, too difficult to access that the timber quality wasn't worth the effort. But I'd seen the satellite imagery, and I knew they were lying. Something about that valley made people uncomfortable, and I was determined to find out what. I wish I'd listened to those warnings. I wish I'd stayed away from that place and the ancient markers I found there, because what I discovered changed everything I thought I understood about the land beneath my feet. I hiked into the valley on July the 12th, following old logging roads that had been reclaimed by forest decades ago. The trees were massive, black spruce and balsam fir that had been growing undisturbed for a century or more. Perfect timber, exactly what the logging companies wanted. But within the first hour, I started noticing things that didn't fit. Survey markers from the 1960s, old metal tags nailed to trees, but arranged in patterns that made no sense for a timber survey. They formed perfect circles, geometric arrangements that seemed deliberately placed for some purpose other than marking harvest boundaries. I photographed them and kept moving, marking my own survey points as I went deeper into the valley. My GPS started acting strange around noon. The coordinates would jump suddenly, showing me kilometers away from where I actually was, then snap back to the correct location. My compass spun uselessly, the needle rotating without settling on any consistent direction. I'd dealt with magnetic anomalies before. There are deposits of magnetite and other minerals in Newfoundland that can throw off instruments, but this felt different, more deliberate somehow, like the land itself was trying to disorient me. I relied on my paper maps and natural landmarks, old-school navigation that couldn't be disrupted by whatever was affecting my electronics. By mid-afternoon, I'd found something that stopped me cold. A clearing about 30 meters across, hidden in the dense forest where satellite imagery couldn't have spotted it. 13 wooden posts driven into the ground in a specific geometric pattern. A central post with 12 others arranged in a perfect circle around it, each exactly the same distance from the center. The posts were old, weathered gray by decades of exposure, but still solid. And carved into each one were symbols I didn't recognize. Not petroglyphs or indigenous markings that I was familiar with, but something else. Angular, deliberate, reminiscent of both European runes and indigenous pictographs, but not quite either. The ground around the posts was bare dirt, no vegetation growing in the pattern they created. Like the earth itself, rejected plant life in that configuration. I should have left then. Every instinct I had screamed that I was in a place I didn't belong, that these posts were marking something that shouldn't be disturbed. But I'm a surveyor, trained to document and measure, and curiosity overrode caution. I photographed the posts, measured the distances between them, sketched the symbols in my field notebook. The central post was taller than the others, maybe 3 meters high, and the wood felt wrong under my hand. Too smooth, too cold, like it was drawing heat out of my skin. I tried to read the weathering patterns to determine how old it was, but the wood showed inconsistent aging. Some sections looked 50 years old, others looked like they'd been placed yesterday. That's when the time distortion started. I checked my watch, 3:47 p.m. I walked the perimeter of the circle, counting my steps and taking measurements. When I finished and checked my watch again, it read 5:32. Nearly 2 hours had passed in what felt like 10 minutes. My GPS, when it worked, showed me covering impossible distances. One reading placed me 8 kilometers east of the clearing. The next showed me right back where I started. The sun's position in the sky didn't match what my watch indicated. Everything about that place violated normal physics, normal time, normal space. I decided to leave, to get back to my base camp and report what I'd found. But finding my way out proved harder than it should have been. The forest looked different. Trees I was certain I'd passed on the way in weren't where I remembered them. I'd hike for what felt like hours, only to end up back at the clearing with the 13 posts, like the forest was looping me back no matter which direction I chose. My water was running low, and the sun was setting when it should have been the middle of the afternoon based on what my watch said. Nothing made sense, and panic was starting to override my training. I made camp that night at the edge of the clearing, too disoriented to keep trying to navigate in the failing light. As darkness fell, I heard sounds, not animals, not wind, but voices. Human voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize, words that sounded like French mixed with indigenous languages, and something older, something that predated both. The voices came from all directions, echoing through the trees, and they were chanting. The same phrases repeated in rhythm, and I realized with growing horror that the rhythm matched my heartbeat, matched the pulse I could feel in my temples, like the voices were somehow synchronized with my own biology. I huddled in my tent, flashlight gripped in one hand and my satellite phone in the other, but the phone showed no signal. Not just weak signal, but nothing, like I was in a dead zone where telecommunications didn't exist. The chanting continued through the night, sometimes close, sometimes distant, never quite close enough to see who or what was making the sounds. And I saw lights moving through the trees. Not flashlight beams, but something else. A pale blue-green phosphorescence that moved with purpose, circling the clearing, crossing through spaces where the posts created sightlines. At some point, I must have slept because I woke to daylight and silence. The voices were gone, the lights were gone, and my instruments were working again. My GPS showed my actual location. My compass pointed consistently north, and my watch matched the sun's position. I packed up faster than I've ever broken camp in my life and navigated out of that valley using the most direct route I could plot. I didn't stop to survey anything, didn't mark any more trees, just got out of there as fast as I could manage with a full pack on rough terrain. When I got back to civilization 3 days later, I went straight to the Historical Society in Corner Brook. I needed to understand what I'd found, needed to know if anyone else had documented those posts and symbols. An elderly archivist, after I described what I'd seen, pulled out files that had been in storage since the 1970s. Documents from a logging camp that had operated in that valley in 1967. The camp employed 43 men, and they'd started cutting timber in that exact area. But something went wrong. The reports were vague, redacted in places, but I gathered that the crew had experienced unusual phenomena. Equipment failures, time discrepancies, workers reporting voices, and lights in the forest. 3 men from that crew tried to remove the posts, thinking they were just old boundary markers from some forgotten survey. Those 3 men disappeared. Search parties combed the valley for weeks and found nothing, no bodies, no equipment, no trace. The logging camp was abandoned, the operation shut down, and the area was quietly designated as unsuitable for harvest. The official reason was poor timber quality and difficult terrain, but the internal documents told a different story. The logging company knew something was in that valley, something that had been marked and contained by those 13 posts, and disturbing them had consequences. I found more records going back further. A survey crew in 1953 that documented the posts and reported temporal anomalies and auditory phenomena. A prospecting team in 1938 that noted the clearing and suggested it should be avoided, and handwritten notes from a priest in the early 1900s who'd been told by local indigenous people that the valley contained boundary markers placed by their ancestors to seal something that shouldn't be released, something that existed before human settlement and would exist after, something that didn't follow the rules of normal reality. I filed my survey report and marked the valley as inaccessible due to equipment malfunctions and dangerous terrain. The logging company wasn't happy. They'd wanted that timber, but I refused to go back, refused to send anyone else into that place. 6 months later, the Forestry Service quietly designated the entire valley as a protected conservation zone. No harvesting, no development, no public access without special permits that were essentially impossible to obtain. The official reason was habitat protection for endangered species. But I knew the real reason. They wanted that valley sealed off, wanted to make sure no one disturbed those posts again. I still have the photographs I took, the sketches of those symbols in my field notebook, but looking at them makes me feel sick, makes my vision blur and my head ache. The patterns seem to shift when I'm not looking directly at them, and I swear the symbols are slightly different each time I check, like they're rearranging themselves on the page. I showed them to a linguist at Memorial University, and she got a nosebleed within 5 minutes of examining them, said they triggered something in her visual cortex that her brain couldn't process properly. I don't take contracts in that region anymore. I work further south now, in areas that have been heavily logged and surveyed for decades, places where there's no possibility of stumbling onto something ancient and wrong. But I think about that valley sometimes, about those 13 posts and whatever they're containing. I think about the 3 men who tried to remove them in 1967, about where they went when they disappeared, if they're still somewhere in that valley existing in the loops of distorted time. And I wonder what would happen if the posts ever failed, if weather or time or deliberate human action ever broke the containment they provide. Some boundaries exist for reasons we're not meant to fully understand, and crossing them comes with consequences that can't be undone. My name is Mackenzie, and I'm 38 years old. I work as a mining geologist in Dawson City, Yukon, assessing potential sites for gold extraction in one of the most remote regions of Canada. It's March 2022, and I've been up here for 3 months, evaluating a new site about 40 kilometers outside town. The permafrost has been melting faster than anyone predicted. Climate change is hitting the Arctic harder than anywhere else on the planet, and that's exposing geological layers that have been frozen solid for tens of thousands of years. We thought it was an opportunity, a chance to access mineral deposits that were previously unreachable. We were wrong. What we found in that thawing ground wasn't gold or minerals or anything we were prepared to deal with. It was something that had been waiting in frozen stasis for longer than human civilization has existed, and disturbing it set off a chain of events that still terrifies me when I think about the implications. The excavation started on March 7th. We had a crew of 12 workers using modern equipment to dig test shafts through the permafrost, taking core samples to determine the viability of a full-scale mining operation. The work was loud, constant, diesel generators running 24 hours a day, drilling equipment pounding into frozen earth that rang like concrete under our tools. On the 3rd day of drilling, we hit something unusual. The core sample came up with organic material embedded in it, tissue that had been preserved perfectly by the ice. At first, we thought it was mammoth or some other Ice Age megafauna. Extinct animal remains turn up fairly regularly in Yukon excavations, and there's a whole protocol for handling paleontological discoveries. But when we cleaned off the sample and really looked at it, we realized it wasn't any animal we recognized. The tissue structure was wrong. The cellular composition didn't match anything in the reference materials we had on site. And the bones, what little we could see of them, had proportions that didn't fit known mammalian anatomy. Too long, too many joints, segments that bent in ways that shouldn't be possible for terrestrial vertebrates. I took photographs and sent them to colleagues at University of Alberta who specialize in paleontology and ancient biology. While we waited for their analysis, the excavation supervisor, a man who'd been doing this work for 20 years, made the decision to keep digging. We needed to know what we'd found, needed to document it properly. Over the next 2 days, we uncovered more remains. Not just one specimen, but multiple individuals, all preserved in the same geological layer that carbon dating eventually placed at over 40,000 years old. Pre-human, pre-Clovis, from a time when this entire region was covered in glacial ice sheets kilometers thick. The specimens measured between 2.5 and 3 meters in length, with elongated limbs and skeletal structures that suggested they'd been adapted for extreme cold environments. But the really disturbing part was their skulls. The cranial capacity was large, comparable to modern humans, which suggested intelligence. These weren't just animals. They were something else, something that had lived and possibly thought and existed in the Ice Age Arctic before being frozen and preserved by the advancing glaciers. On March 12th, one of the excavation workers started showing symptoms: fever, elevated temperature that spiked to 39 degrees Celsius within hours. We thought it was flu or some infection picked up from handling ancient organic material. Diseases can survive in permafrost, and we're always careful about contamination protocols. But his symptoms progressed in ways that didn't match any known illness. He became disoriented, confused, speaking in fragments that didn't make sense. And his neural activity, when we got him to the medical clinic in Dawson City for assessment, showed patterns that the doctors couldn't explain. The MRI revealed unusual activity in regions of the brain that are normally dormant, structures lighting up in ways that suggested they were being activated by something external. 2 more workers developed the same symptoms within 24 hours. All 3 had been directly involved in extracting and handling the preserved specimens. The clinic doctor contacted provincial health authorities, and suddenly we had epidemiologists flying up from Whitehorse trying to determine what pathogen we'd released from the permafrost. They took blood samples, tissue biopsies, ran every test in their arsenal. The results showed microscopic organisms in the infected workers' bloodstreams, some kind of extremophile bacteria or archaea that had survived 40,000 years of frozen dormancy and reactivated upon thaw. But more disturbing was what these organisms were doing to their hosts. The 3 infected workers started exhibiting coordinated behavior. They'd speak in unison sometimes, finish each other's sentences, move in synchronized patterns like they were receiving the same neural input. Brain scans showed their neural activity synchronizing, different individuals displaying identical patterns at the exact same moments. It was like they were becoming nodes in a network, their individual consciousnesses being subsumed into something collective. And they kept trying to reach a specific location, a geological formation about 8 kilometers northeast of the excavation site. They'd become agitated when prevented from moving in that direction, would pace and mutter about coordinates and depths that matched that exact location. I contacted researchers at University of Alberta with the medical data and the geological findings. What came back made my blood run cold. This wasn't the first time something like this had been discovered in the Canadian Arctic. There were suppressed reports going back to the 1950s of similar finds during early Cold War military excavations, preserved specimens with unusual anatomy, workers developing strange symptoms and hive-like behaviors, sites being sealed and classified. The pattern was consistent across 17 separate incidents over 70 years. Every single case had been contained and buried, covered up by various levels of government and military authority, under the justification of national security and public safety. On March 16th, the military arrived. Not local RCMP or territorial authorities, but actual Canadian Armed Forces personnel with hazmat protocols and containment equipment. They quarantined the entire excavation site, isolated the 3 infected workers, and began systematic decontamination procedures. I was interrogated for 6 hours about what we'd found, what we'd documented, who we'd contacted. They confiscated all our samples, all our data, every photograph and measurement we'd taken. The official story became environmental contamination, a toxic chemical spill that required professional cleanup. The mining operation was permanently suspended, and every worker on site was required to sign non-disclosure agreements backed by federal security legislation. But I saw what happened before they took the infected workers away. All 3 of them standing at the fence line of the quarantine zone, facing northeast toward that geological formation they'd been trying to reach. and they were speaking, all three in perfect unison, in a language that wasn't English or French or any indigenous dialect. The sounds were complex, layered, like multiple voices speaking through single throats. The military personnel recording them looked terrified, and I understood why. These weren't just infected people anymore. They were being used as transmitters, as communication devices for something that existed in that preserved biological matter, something ancient that was trying to reconnect with others of its kind that might still be frozen in the permafrost. I learned later, through contacts who violated their own NDAs to share information, that the military deployed ground-penetrating radar to that northeast location the infected workers had been fixated on. They found a massive deposit of the same organic material buried under 80 meters of permafrost, thousands of specimens, an entire population that had been flash frozen during the last glacial maximum and preserved in stasis for over 40 millennia. The site was sealed with concrete, the coordinates classified, and the area designated as permanently off-limits for any kind of development or excavation. The three infected workers were taken to an undisclosed medical facility. I never learned what happened to them, whether they recovered or remained in that networked state. But I think about them sometimes, about what it must be like to have your individual consciousness dissolved into something collective and ancient, to become a node in a hive mind that spans geological time. And I think about climate change, about the permafrost that's melting across the entire Arctic, exposing layers of Earth that have been frozen since the Ice Age. There are probably hundreds of these sites across the Canadian Arctic, the Siberian tundra, the Alaskan interior, places where these organisms or entities or whatever they were got frozen during the glacial advances and have been waiting in dormant stasis ever since. As the permafrost melts, as we dig deeper for resources and minerals, we're going to keep finding them. And every time we do, there's a risk of releasing biological agents that can reactivate and affect human neurology in ways we don't understand, that can turn people into transmission nodes for something that existed long before we did. I quit geology after Dawson City. I couldn't keep doing work that might involve excavating ancient permafrost, that might release more of whatever we'd found. I work in Vancouver now, as far from the Arctic as I can get while still being in Canada. But I monitor the news obsessively, watching for reports of unusual illnesses in northern communities, unexplained neural disorders in excavation workers, any sign that another site has been disturbed. Because I know it's going to happen again. The permafrost is melting. The ancient layers are being exposed. And eventually someone else is going to find what we found. And maybe next time, the containment won't be fast enough. Maybe next time, the infection will spread beyond 3 people, will reach a critical mass where it can't be controlled. My name is Joseph, and I'm 30 years old. I've been a wilderness guide in La Ronge, Saskatchewan for the past 8 years, taking hunters and fishing parties into the boreal forest during all seasons. I know this territory better than most people know their own neighborhoods. Every frozen lake, every game trail, every shelter where you can wait out a storm. January 2008 was one of the coldest winters on record, with temperatures dropping to minus 40 Celsius and staying there for weeks. The kind of cold that makes your breath freeze in your lungs, that turns exposed skin to frostbite in under 5 minutes, that makes even experienced northerners think twice before going outside. I was guiding a hunting party, 3 guys from Saskatchewan who wanted to experience real winter wilderness and maybe bag a moose if we got lucky. We had good equipment, plenty of supplies, and I'd run this exact route dozens of times before. But nothing, and I mean nothing in my 8 years of guiding, prepared me for what we encountered out there in the darkness between the trees. We left La Ronge on January 15th, 3 clients and me on 4 snowmobiles, heading northeast into Crownland, where hunting permits were still valid. The plan was simple: 5 days out, camping in established sites, following game trails, and checking areas where moose had been spotted in previous seasons. The weather forecast was clear, no storms expected, just the constant brutal cold that defines Saskatchewan winters. We made good time the first day, covering about 60 kilometers before setting up camp near a frozen creek bed. The clients were enthusiastic, excited to be out in genuine wilderness, and the evening was pleasant enough. We built a fire, cooked dinner, told stories, and fell asleep in our insulated tents with the temperature gauge reading -38. I woke around 3 in the morning to my hunting partner Matthew radioing from his tent. He'd gone outside to relieve himself and seen tracks circling our camp. Fresh tracks, made within the last hour based on how crisp the edges were in the snow. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and went to look. The tracks were bizarre, bipedal. Definitely something walking on 2 legs, but the gait was wrong. The stride length suggested something at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller, and the foot impressions showed only 4 toes instead of 5. No human walked like that. No bear either. Bears don't move bipedally in winter, and even if they did, the track pattern didn't match. The prints came from the tree line, circled our camp in a wide perimeter, about 50 meters out, and disappeared back into the forest heading northeast. Matthew thought it might be another person, someone else camping in the area who'd been curious about our fire. But I'd been guiding in this region for years, and I knew those tracks weren't human. The toe spread was too wide. The depth of the impression suggested something much heavier than a person, and there was a drag mark behind each print like whatever made them had difficulty lifting its feet completely between steps. I radioed the other 2 clients, got everyone awake and alert, and we spent the rest of the night feeding the fire and keeping watch. Nothing approached. We heard branches breaking in the distance, sounds of something large moving through the forest, but nothing came close enough to see. At first light, we broke camp. The clients wanted to continue the hunt. They'd paid good money for this trip and weren't ready to turn back because of strange tracks. I agreed reluctantly, but I changed our route. Instead of heading deeper into the backcountry, I planned a loop that would bring us closer to established trails where we could get back to civilization quickly if we needed to. We loaded up the snowmobiles and headed out, following a ridge line that gave us good visibility of the surrounding terrain. That's when I noticed we were being followed. The tracks paralleled our route, staying in the tree line about 100 meters to our right. Whatever made them was keeping pace with us, matching our speed, maintaining that consistent distance. I stopped the group several times to observe, and each time we halted, the sounds of movement in the forest stopped too. It was tracking us deliberately, intelligently, using the cover of trees to stay hidden while monitoring our progress. My game cameras, which I'd set up at the previous night's camp and collected before leaving, had captured something on the motion sensors. The images were blurred, like the camera had been shaking when it triggered, but I could make out a shape among the trees. Tall, emaciated, with what looked like an elongated skull or antlers protruding from its head. The shape was wrong for any animal I knew, wrong in a way that made my hands shake when I looked at the photos. We pushed hard that day, trying to put distance between us and whatever was following. But by late afternoon, our snowmobiles started having problems. Luke's machine died first, the engine cutting out despite having a full tank and being in perfect mechanical condition that morning. We tried to restart it, check the fuel lines and spark plugs, but nothing worked. It was like the cold had penetrated some critical component and killed it. We redistributed gear and doubled up on the remaining machines, leaving Luke's snowmobile behind with plans to retrieve it later. Then Matthew's machine started losing power, the engine running rough and misfiring. We were still 40 kilometers from La Ronge, and the sun was setting. We found shelter in a small clearing surrounded by dense spruce trees and set up camp while we still had daylight. I established a perimeter with rope and bells, a simple early warning system if anything approached during the night. We built the biggest fire we could manage, using deadfall wood and some of our emergency fuel to keep the flames high. The clients were scared. Now, no longer enthusiastic about wilderness adventure, they'd seen the tracks, they'd heard the sounds, and they understood we were being hunted by something that didn't belong in any naturalist field guide. The creature came after dark. We saw it briefly, illuminated by firelight when it rushed the edge of our camp around 10 p.m. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall with a skeletal frame that looked emaciated but moved with terrifying speed. The skull was elongated, with antlers or bone protrusions that created a horrific silhouette against the trees. Its skin was pale, almost translucent in the firelight, pulled tight over bones that seemed too angular, too wrong. It made sounds as it circled us, vocalizations that were part animal, part something else, clicking, hissing, a wet breathing that carried through the cold air. We fired rifles at it when it got close, aiming for center mass like you would with any dangerous game. But the bullets didn't seem to affect it. We saw impacts, saw it flinch, but it didn't go down. It just retreated back into the darkness and continued circling. We stayed awake all night, taking turns feeding the fire and watching the perimeter. The creature never stopped moving around us, never gave up, just maintained its patient predatory circling. It would rush in occasionally, testing our defenses, seeing how close it could get before we reacted. Each time we drove it back with rifle fire and shouted threats, but each time it returned, and I could sense it was learning our patterns, figuring out our weaknesses. Matthew broke down around 4 a.m., started crying and praying, convinced we were going to die out there. Luke just sat in silence, gripping his rifle with white knuckles, staring into the darkness beyond our firelight. Dawn broke around 7:30, and the creature disappeared. No final rush, no dramatic confrontation. It just faded back into the forest as light spread across the landscape. We didn't wait around. We abandoned everything except essential survival gear, doubled and tripled up on the 2 functioning snowmobiles, and raced back toward La Ronge. The machines ran perfectly now. Whatever had been affecting them the previous day apparently resolved by daylight. We covered those 40 kilometers in record time, not stopping until we reached the first houses on the outskirts of town. I reported the incident to the RCMP, showed them the game camera photos, and described what we'd seen. The officer who took my statement listened politely, wrote everything down, and told me they'd look into it. But I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe me. He mentioned bears, moose, maybe a wolf pack, suggested that exhaustion and cold can play tricks on the mind. Then an older constable, who'd been working in the area for 20 years, pulled me aside. He didn't ask questions about what I'd seen. Instead, he showed me a map with several marked locations and told me there were areas the local Cree community avoided during winter, places where hunters had disappeared over the years, where strange remains had been found. He identified what I'd encountered from my description. Wedico, Wendigo. The names vary depending on which indigenous nation you ask, but the creature is consistent across northern folklore. A spirit of winter hunger and isolation, something that embodies starvation and cold and the madness that comes from extreme deprivation. It hunts during the darkest, coldest part of winter, and it targets people who venture too deep into the wilderness. The constable told me that every few years someone sees it, usually experienced outdoors people like me who know the difference between normal wildlife and something else. And every few years, someone doesn't make it back. I haven't guided winter expeditions since January 2008. I still work as a wilderness guide, but only during summer and fall when the days are long and the creature, whatever it is, doesn't hunt. My clients from that trip never came back to Saskatchewan. Matthew moved to Ontario, Luke quit hunting entirely, and the third guy, whose name I've tried to forget, changed his phone number and blocked all contact. We don't talk about what happened, don't share the story at hunting lodges or around campfires, because we know how it sounds. We know people would dismiss it as cold-induced hallucination or mass hysteria, but I still have the game camera photos. though I can't look at them without feeling sick. I still remember that skeletal silhouette and those wet, clicking sounds, and I still dream about being circled in the darkness by something that moves just beyond the light, something that embodies every fear humans have carried since we first ventured into winter landscapes and realized we weren't alone out there. My name is Myra, and I'm 26 years old. I work as a radio station engineer for a small community broadcaster in Flin Flon, Manitoba, maintaining the equipment and keeping us on the air. It's mostly solitary work, especially the night shifts when I'm alone in the broadcast tower about 15 kilometers outside town. November 2014 was unusually cold even for Manitoba, with early snow and temperatures that dropped fast after sunset. I'd been working nights for 3 years and never had problems with the isolation. I actually preferred it. No interruptions, just me and the equipment and whatever music or shows were scheduled for overnight broadcast. But on November 8th, something changed. I started picking up a signal that shouldn't have existed, and what began as a technical curiosity became a nightmare that made me question my own sanity and left me unable to trust my own perceptions of reality. It started around 2 in the morning. I was running routine checks on our broadcast frequency when I noticed interference, a pirate signal bleeding into our channel. This happens occasionally, usually truckers with overpowered CB radios or amateur operators who don't know they're violating broadcast regulations. But this signal was different. It was a voice, male, reading information in a monotone that made my skin crawl. Not the words themselves at first, just the delivery. Flat, emotionless, like a computer-generated voice reading from a database. I tried to track the source using our directional equipment, but the signals seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere. No clear point of origin. Then I started listening to what the voice was actually saying. Names, addresses, personal details. It read information about people in Flin Flon, their full names, where they lived, who their family members were, what cars they drove. I recognized some of the names, people I knew casually from town. The level of detail was disturbing and impossible. This wasn't public information. This was intimate knowledge that no pirate broadcaster should have access to. I recorded the transmission and reported it to my supervisor. But when I played back the recording the next morning, the voice was garbled, unintelligible static that conveyed nothing. The transmissions continued every night, always starting around 2 a.m., always that same flat voice reading personal information about local residents. And then it started making predictions. Small things at first. The voice would say someone's car wouldn't start the next morning. And sure enough, when I checked with people in town, they'd had exactly that problem. It predicted a minor house fire on November 12th, gave the exact address 3 days in advance. The fire happened. An electrical problem in the kitchen contained quickly, no injuries, but it happened exactly as the voice had described. I was terrified, but also morbidly fascinated. I started documenting everything, writing down the predictions and checking them against actual events. On November 15th, the voice mentioned my name. Myra, 26, radio engineer. Transmission tower 14.7 kilometers northeast of Flin Flon. You're listening. My blood went ice cold. Whatever was generating this signal knew I was monitoring it, knew exactly who I was and where I was. Then it started reading details about my life. My mother's maiden name, the exact time I was born, my bank account balance, dreams I'd had as a child that I'd never told anyone. It was like something had access to every piece of information about me, public and private, conscious and buried. I tried to shut down the receiver, but the voice continued. I could hear it even with the equipment powered off, a faint whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The predictions became darker. The voice started announcing deaths, not immediately, but days in advance. It would give a name and a date, and with sick certainty I'd wait to hear the news. And every time, without fail, the person died. Car accidents, heart attacks, a drowning in a frozen lake. The causes varied, but the timing was always exact. I went to the RCMP with my documentation, tried to explain that something was predicting these deaths before they happened. The officer who took my statement was sympathetic, but clearly thought I was experiencing some kind of breakdown. He suggested I take time off, get some rest, maybe talk to a counselor about the stress of working nights alone. But I couldn't stop listening. The transmissions had become an obsession. I needed to understand what was generating them, where they were coming from, how they could possibly know these things before they happened. On November 20th, I decided to track the signal to its source. I had equipment that could triangulate radio transmissions if I could get multiple readings from different locations. I mapped out several sites around Flin Flon and spent a night driving between them, taking readings whenever the voice appeared on the frequency. The triangulation pointed to an abandoned relay station about 40 kilometers southwest of town, a facility that had been decommissioned in the late 1970s when the broadcasting infrastructure was upgraded. I drove out there the next day, alone, which in retrospect was incredibly stupid. The relay station was exactly as I'd expected, a small concrete building with a radio tower surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusted chain-link fence. The building should have been empty, the equipment long since removed or sold for scrap. But when I broke the lock and went inside, I found active equipment. Old equipment, vacuum tube technology from the 1960s or earlier, but somehow still functioning. The transmitter was running despite having no visible power source. No generator, no connection to the electrical grid, just these ancient machines humming and glowing in the darkness of that abandoned building. I found journals in the station, handwritten logs from an engineer named Davina, who'd worked there in the early 70s. The entries started normally enough. Routine maintenance notes, technical observations, complaints about the isolation, but they became increasingly disturbed. Davina wrote about hearing voices in the static, about the equipment picking up signals that weren't being transmitted from any known source. She described becoming obsessed with what she called time signals, transmissions that seemed to contain information about events that hadn't happened yet. The final entries were barely coherent, rambling descriptions of seeing the future in the static patterns, of understanding that time wasn't linear, that past and future existed simultaneously, and the right equipment could access both. The last dated entry was from April 1973. It said, "I finally understand. The transmissions aren't predictions. They're recordings. Everything that will happen has already happened somewhere else in the structure of time. I'm going to listen to all of it. I'm going to hear everything." There were no more entries after that, and according to local records I checked later, Davina disappeared in April 1973. Her body was never found, the case never solved. I should have destroyed the equipment right then, should have called authorities, reported the site, had it demolished. But I made the mistake of listening to the transmission one more time. I turned on the receiver and heard that flat, emotionless voice, and it was speaking in real time, describing what I was doing at that exact moment. "Myra, Relay Station 47, reading the journals. You'll try to leave in 3 minutes. Your car won't start. You'll walk back to the highway. It will take 48 minutes. The temperature is -22. Every word was accurate. I tried to leave and my car was dead, battery drained despite being fine when I arrived. I walked back to the highway in exactly 48 minutes according to my watch, and the temperature was -22. The transmissions didn't stop after I left the relay station. They continued every night at 2 a.m., and now they were focused entirely on me. The voice described my future in detailed specific terms. What I would eat for breakfast, who would call me, what I would dream about, and every prediction came true with mechanical precision. I was trapped in a predetermined timeline. Every action I took already recorded somewhere in that transmission from outside normal time. I started trying to break the predictions, to do things the voice didn't anticipate. but I couldn't. Every attempt to deviate resulted in circumstances that forced me back to the predicted path. It was like free will was an illusion, and I was just following a script written before I was born. I went back to the relay station with tools and fuel. I was going to destroy the equipment, burn the whole building down if I had to, but I couldn't make myself do it. Standing there in front of those glowing vacuum tubes, listening to that voice describe my future, I realized that destroying them wouldn't change anything. The transmissions weren't causing the predetermined timeline. They were just revealing it. Everything was already decided, already recorded somewhere in the structure of time that human consciousness normally can't access. I took medical leave from the radio station, spent 2 months in psychiatric evaluation, trying to convince doctors I wasn't having a breakdown. They prescribed medication for anxiety and possible schizophrenia, suggested that the isolation and night shifts had triggered some kind of psychotic episode. Maybe they're right. Maybe I imagined all of it. But I still hear whispers in static, still catch fragments of that flat voice in white noise and radio interference. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I tune through frequencies on my personal receiver, and I find it. That transmission from the relay station still broadcasting despite me having cut the power, still reading the future in its emotionless monotone. I don't work in radio anymore. I live in Winnipeg now, far from Flin Flon and that relay station. But distance doesn't matter. The voice finds me wherever I go, whispering through electrical noise and signal interference, reading the script of my life before I live it. And the worst part isn't knowing the future. The worst part is understanding that everything I do, every choice I think I'm making, was already decided long ago. Free will is the cruelest illusion, and consciousness is just experiencing a predetermined recording. That's what the transmission taught me. That's what I learned in that relay station in November 2014, and it's a knowledge I can never unknow, a truth I'll carry until the voice reads the date and circumstances of my death, which it will, eventually, because everything is already recorded somewhere in the static. My name is Flora, and I'm 35 years old. I work for Statistics Canada conducting door-to-door census surveys in remote areas of British Columbia. It's September 2020, middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, which made the work even more challenging than usual. Most people were nervous about face-to-face contact, and getting accurate population data in isolated communities required patience and careful adherence to safety protocols. I'd been assigned to the Terrace region, covering logging camps and small settlements scattered through the northern interior, where official records were often incomplete or outdated. The job required driving hundreds of kilometers on logging roads, hiking to camps that weren't on any GPS system, and talking to people who often preferred to stay off government radar entirely. On September 23rd, I found a logging camp that shouldn't have existed, and what I discovered there made me question everything I understood about reality, time, and the nature of tragedy that leaves scars so deep they echo across decades. I was following my assigned route, checking off locations on my survey map, and documenting population counts for the 2020 census. The area around Terrace is heavily forested, with logging operations that have been active for over a century. Many camps are temporary, set up for a season or two, and then abandoned when the timber in that area is depleted. But my records showed a permanent camp at coordinates that placed it about 30 kilometers east of Terrace, in a valley that had good road access and steady timber resources. The camp wasn't on my official list, but I'd learned to check everything. Sometimes operations don't report properly, and finding undocumented residents was part of my job. I reached the location around noon. The camp was modern, well-maintained, with new trailers and equipment that looked like it had been installed recently. There were 23 workers visible, going about their daily routines, maintaining equipment, processing lumber, preparing for the afternoon shift. Everything looked normal and contemporary. The workers were polite when I approached, friendly even, though they seemed a bit surprised to see a census worker. I explained my purpose and started asking the standard questions: name, age, citizenship status, how long they'd been at this location, who their employer was. That's when things got strange. None of them had identification. Not one person could produce a driver's license, social insurance card, passport, or any official documentation. They claimed they'd left everything in Terrace, that they didn't need ID at the camp. But when I asked for their social insurance numbers so I could verify their records in the system, they gave me numbers that were formatted wrong, that didn't match the pattern Statistics Canada uses. And their employer, a company called Northern Timber Operations, didn't exist in any business registry I could access on my tablet. No incorporation papers, no tax records, nothing. The workers themselves seemed genuine enough. They talked about their jobs, their families, their plans for when the season ended, but there was something off about the details. They mentioned towns that had changed names decades ago, referenced prices and wages that seemed absurdly low for 2020, wore clothing that looked contemporary but had subtle differences in style that I couldn't quite place. And none of them mentioned COVID-19, didn't ask about case numbers or vaccination timelines or any of the pandemic concerns that dominated every conversation in 2020. It was like they existed in a bubble completely isolated from current events. I took photographs of the camp, documented the trailers and equipment, recorded names and basic information even without being able to verify identities. The whole situation violated multiple census protocols, but I needed evidence of what I was seeing. Before I left, I told them I'd need to return with my supervisor to sort out the documentation issues. They nodded, said they'd be there, and went back to their work. I drove back to Terrace, troubled by what I'd found, but not yet understanding the full strangeness of the situation. The next morning, I returned with my supervisor and an RCMP officer. We drove to the exact coordinates I'd documented the previous day. The camp was gone. Not abandoned, not recently cleared out, but gone. The forest was undisturbed, with mature trees growing in spaces where trailers and equipment had stood just 24 hours earlier. No tire tracks, no cleared areas, no evidence that humans had been there recently. The officer thought I'd gotten the location wrong, but I had GPS coordinates, photographs, detailed notes. We searched the entire area within a kilometer radius. Nothing. It was like the camp had never existed. Back in Terrace, I started researching. I pulled historical records from the local archives, looking for any mention of Northern Timber Operations or logging camps at those coordinates. What I found made my hands shake. In 1952, there had been a logging camp at that exact location. The company name was different, but the camp layout in historical photographs matched what I'd seen. Same trailer arrangement, same equipment positioning. And in July 1952, there had been a flash flood in that valley. Heavy rains upstream caused a wall of water to rush through the camp during the night shift. 23 workers died, all of them. The bodies were recovered and buried, the camp was abandoned, and the company went bankrupt from the lawsuits and loss. I compared the names I'd collected during my census visit to the list of workers who died in 1952. They matched, every single name. The ages were different. The people I'd met were in their 20s and 30s, while the death record showed a wider age range. But the names were identical. I'd documented 23 workers at a camp that had been destroyed 68 years ago, spoken to people who died before my parents were born. I tried to explain this to my supervisor, showed him the photographs and historical records. But my photographs were gone from my camera, not deleted. The camera showed no record that photos had ever been taken that day, like the memory card had been wiped clean but without any deletion record. My handwritten notes were still there, names and details I'd recorded in my field notebook. But without the photos, there was no way to prove what I'd seen. I contacted a university historian who specialized in BC logging history. I described what I'd found, shared the historical records, and my census documentation. She wasn't surprised. She told me about similar incidents documented at other disaster sites across British Columbia, places where catastrophic events had killed entire communities or work crews, locations that sometimes manifested temporal echoes, moments frozen in time, replaying before the disaster occurred. The camps appear in September or October, always in the months before the historical tragedy, populated by people who don't know they're going to die, who exist in a bubble of time before their world ended. The historian had documented 17 similar cases over 40 years of research. A fishing boat that sank in 1967 had been seen by Coast Guard patrols in 2003, the crew waving cheerfully hours before the historical date of their deaths. A mining camp destroyed by a collapse in 1934 had been found by hikers in 1998, the miners working normally, unaware their entire operation would be buried under tons of rock the following week, according to historical records. In every case, the manifestations appeared in the weeks or months before the anniversary of the disaster, existed for a brief time, and then vanished without trace. She called them pre-mortem echoes, moments of normal life preserved in some quantum temporal loop that played out repeatedly, giving the dead a chance to exist again in the brief time before they died. The people in these echoes weren't ghosts. They were experiencing their actual lives, unaware that they were temporal recordings playing out across decades. And observers like me were seeing into a moment that existed simultaneously in 1952 and 2220, a quantum overlap where both time frames occupied the same space briefly. I went back to those coordinates on September 30th, October 7th, October 15th. The camp never reappeared, but I found something else on my October visit. A small memorial plaque I hadn't noticed before, weathered and overgrown, commemorating the 23 workers who died in the 1952 flood. The plaque listed their names, the same names I'd collected during my census visit. I left flowers there, though I'm not sure why. Maybe because I'd spoken to them, however briefly across 7 decades of time. Maybe because I was one of the few people who knew they still existed somewhere, trapped in a loop of normal, workdays before the catastrophe that ended their lives. Statistics Canada dismissed my report as a clerical error. The camp was removed from my survey route, classified as a historical site with no current population. I continued my census work for the rest of 2020, but I couldn't stop thinking about those 23 workers, about how real they'd seemed, how alive. They hadn't been ghosts or spirits. They'd been people living their lives. And somehow I'd crossed into their timeline and spoken to them in their final weeks of existence, though they didn't know they were final weeks. I researched quantum physics, temporal mechanics, theories about time being non-linear and all moments existing simultaneously. None of it provided satisfying answers. The truth is that reality is stranger than we acknowledge. That time isn't the simple linear progression we experience consciously, and that tragedies can scar a location so deeply that the moment before the tragedy plays out repeatedly, a permanent recording preserved in the structure of space-time itself. I still work for Statistics Canada, still conduct surveys in remote areas, but I pay attention now to places that feel wrong, to camps and communities that seem slightly out of phase with current reality. And I wonder how many other census workers have encountered temporal echoes, how many have documented people who died decades ago but don't realize they're dead yet. The official statistics will never reflect these populations. The government databases will never include people who exist outside linear time. But they're there, in quantum pockets scattered across the country, living and working and being human in moments preserved forever between the past and present. Thank you for joining me on Unheard Fears as we explored these 9 disturbing true Canadian small-town horror stories. From cosmic transmissions in the Arctic to temporal echoes in British Columbia, these tales remind us that the most isolated places often harbor the deepest mysteries. If these stories left you unsettled, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next terrifying upload. Drop a comment telling us which story disturbed you most, and stay safe out there.